Mathematics 4, Quarter 4, Week 4. Matatag, Curriculum. For the content, represent decimal numbers using models and manipulatives to show the relationship to fractions. Using models, grid paper, 100ths, manipulatives based on 10 blocks. Read and write decimal numbers with decimal parts to hundredths. For the review, name the fraction that represents the shaded part of each illustration. Here are the correct answers. For letter A, 3/10, B, 5/10 or 1/2. Letter C, 7/10. For the lesson purpose, fractions can be written in another form. Let us look at the following examples. On the first illustration, 3/10, 5/10, 7/10. The numbers 3/10, 5/10, and 7/10 are called decimals. 3/10 can be written as 0.3. 5/10 can be written as 0.5. 7/10 can be written as 0.7. The word decimal comes from the Latin word decimus, meaning tenth. It is from the root word decem, meaning 10. Decimal is a fraction written in a special form where each digit represents a different power of 10. Decimal number is a number that has a decimal point followed by digits that show a value smaller. Where are decimal numbers commonly encountered? You're right, in general weighted average of a student in school, price of goods in malls and supermarkets, body temperature, height and weight of a person, distance from one place to another. Let's have subtopic 1, represent decimal numbers using models and manipulatives. For the activity 1, coloring grid paper. Using grid paper with 100 squares, decimal can be represented using a model such as the grid paper with 100 squares. Let's have a story. Math storytelling. In the Mathemata Kingdom, there lived a beautiful princess named Snowy. One day, while walking through the forest to visit her friends, the 7 dwarfs, she saw a garden where red apples grew abundantly. She noticed that 3 of the trees had 100 red apples each. She decided to pick 15 red apples from the first tree, 44 apples from the second tree, and 8 apples from the third tree. Then, she excitedly went to her friend's house, bringing the red apples. She shared the apples to her friends. Snowy and the 7 dwarfs made a promise to take good care of the forest that provides bountiful fruits to all living things. Using the given story, illustrate the fractions found in the story through the use of grid paper and coloring materials. What fraction represents the red apples picked by Snowy from the first tree? You're right, it is 15 100ths. How should this fraction be written in decimal form? Very good. It's 0.15. What fraction represents the remaining red apples from the first three? You're right. It's 85/100ths. How will this fraction be written in decimal form? Very good. 0.85. Since Snowy picked 15 apples, the fraction that represents them is 15/100ths, which can be written in decimal form as 0.15 and is read as 15/100ths. While the remaining apples from the tree can be represented by the fraction 85/100ths, which can be written in decimal form as 0.85 and is read as 85/100ths. What fraction represents the red apples picked by Snowy from the second tree? Very good. It is 44/100ths. How should this fraction be written in decimal form? You're right. It is 0.44 or 44/100ths. What fractions represents the remaining red apples from the second tree? Very good. It is 56/100ths. How will this fraction be written in decimal form? You're right. 0.56 or read as 56/100ths. 44/100ths in decimal form is 0.44, which is read as 44/100ths. 56/100ths in decimal form is 0.56, which is read as 56/100ths. What fraction represents the red apples picked by Snowy from the third tree? You're right, it's 8/100ths. How should this fraction be written in decimal form? You're right, it's 0.08 or 8/100ths. What fraction represents the remaining red apples from the third tree? You're right, it's 92/100ths. How will this fraction be written in decimal form? Very good. 0.92 or read as 92/100ths. 8/100ths in decimal form is 0.08, which is read as 8/100ths. 92/100ths in decimal form is 0.92, which is read as 92/100ths. Let's have letter B, using base 10 blocks. Base 10 blocks can be used in lessons on whole numbers and decimals. For whole numbers, cube represents thousands, flat represents hundreds, rod represents tens, and unit represents ones. However, for decimals, cube represents tens, flat represents ones, rod represents tens, and unit represents hundreds. A decimal value can be represented using base 10 blocks. For cube, tens, flat, ones, rod, tenths, and for the unit, hundredths. How many rods will make one flat? Very good. One rod is 1/10 of a flat. How many units will make one flat? You're right. One unit is 1/100th of a flat. Using the same examples from math storytelling, represent it using base 10 blocks. Complete the given table below. For the first column, we have fraction, second column decimal, and for the third column, in words. For the fraction, 15/100ths, decimal, 0.15, 1500ths. In words, 1500ths. 44 hundredths. Decimal, 0.44, 44 hundredths. 8 hundredths, 0.08, 8 hundredths. Example 1. Represent 0.15 using base 10 blocks. Zero point 1, 1/10. 0.05, 5 hundredths. Example 2. Represent 0.44 using base 10 blocks. For 0.4, we have 4 tenths. For 0.04, 4 hundredths. Example 3. Represent 0.08 using base 10 blocks. 0.08 or 8 hundredths. Activity 2. There are 3 grade 4 pupils who took a 100-point achievement test in mathematics. They got the following scores. For the first column, pupils Chris, Catherine, and Vince. For their score, in fraction form, 78 hundredths, 95 hundredths, and 62 hundredths. In decimal form, 0.78, 0.95, and 0.62. Represent the scores of grade 4 pupils using grid papers and base 10 blocks. Answers will be presented in the class. Let's answer now. For the score of Chris, using a grid with 100 squares, 0.78 or 78 hundredths. Using base or 10 blocks, 0.7 or 7 tenths, and 0.08 or 8 hundredths. Score of Catherine, using a grid with 100 squares, 0.95 or 95 hundredths. Using base, 10 blocks, 0.9 or 9 tenths, and 0.05 or 5 hundredths. For the score of Vince, using a grid with 100 squares, 0.62 or 62 hundredths. Using base, 10 blocks, 0.6 or 6 tenths, 0.02 or 2 hundredths. Activity 3. Write the fractions and decimals that represent each illustration. Write it in fractions and in decimals. Here are the correct answers. For number 1, for fraction, 65 hundredths. Decimal, 0.65. 2, 30 hundredths, 0.30. Number 3, 1 and 42 hundredths, 1.42. Write the decimals represented by the base 10 blocks. Here are the correct answers. For number 1, 25 hundredths. Number 2, 1 and 44 hundredths. For the lesson activity, using the grid papers with 100 squares, illustrate the following decimals. Number 1, 25 hundredths. 2, 62 hundredths. 3, 5 hundredths. 4, 1 and 30 hundredths. 5, 1 and 9 hundredths. Name the decimals represented by the following base 10 blocks. Let's have number 1 and number 2. Here are the correct answers. For letter B, number 1 is 63 hundredths and number 2 is 3 and 24 hundredths. Read and write decimal numbers with decimal parts to hundredths. Using base 10 blocks and place value math, decimals numbers are read considering the place value. For the place value math, tenths, ones, tenths, hundredths. For the ones, we have 2. For the tenths, 7. And for the hundredths is 2. From left to right, the place value of 2 is ones, 7 is tenths, and 2, rightmost, is hundredths. Therefore, there are 2 ones, 7 tenths, and 2 hundredths. How do we read the given decimal? 2.72 is read as 2 and 72 hundredths. What are the guides or rules in reading decimal numbers? Read the whole number part. If the whole number is 0, then simply read the decimal part. Read the decimal point as end. Read the decimal part like a whole number and affix the place value of the rightmost digit. Let us have other examples. Reading decimal numbers. Read the given decimal number and represent it using base 10 blocks. We read 29.32 as 29 and 32 hundredths. To represent using base 10 blocks, we have 2 tenths, 9 ones, 3 tenths, and 2 hundredths. How to read the given decimals? 0.43 is read as 43 hundredths. 0.7 is read as 7 tenths. 5.82 is read as 5 and 82 hundredths. Writing decimal numbers. Write the following figures in words. Here are the correct answers. For number 1, 6 tenths. 2, 65 hundredths. 3, 14 and 5 tenths. 4, 5 hundredths. Number 5, 102 and 75 hundredths. Complete the table. Here are the correct answers. For number 1, 12 and 3 tenths. 2, 514 and 53 hundredths. 3, 45 hundredths. 4, 16 and 97 hundredths. 5, 78 and 7 tenths. 6, 17 hundredths. Number 7, 15 and 4 tenths. 8, 324 and 9 hundredths. 9, 6 and 46 hundredths. 10, 9 and 16 hundredths. What I learned about decimals. How do we define decimal? And for the fractions can be written in blank form. For the reflection on learning, how can we connect this lesson to our everyday lives? Cite instances where knowledge of decimals is useful in practical contexts. For your assessment, name the fractions and decimals represented by the shaded parts of the grids. Write them in words. Use the table provided to organize your answers. For the first column, we have fraction form, second column decimal form, and third column is word form. We have the first and second grids. For number 3, 4, and 5. For letter B, draw figures of base 10 blocks to represent the given decimal numbers. Then write the numbers in words. For decimal, we have 0.76, 4.11, 32.5, 22.08, and 6.39. For the second column, illustration based on 10 blocks, and write it in words. Here are the correct answers. For letter B,